We are all about worthy causes, and today's shout out is to Changemakers Resettlement Forum for Refugees. This is Kassie's shout out because this organisation is incredible. They envision a New Zealand where New Zealanders from refugee backgrounds can participate fully in Aotearoa New Zealand life. And their principle is nothing about us without us. So people from refugee backgrounds should be involved in all stages where policies and services are being developed by them. They're an amazing organisation, and you can donate to them at www.crf.org.nz, and they are Kassie's choice of shout out today.
Sex, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the speculative interdimensional vehicle, Sex in Space. Its mission, to explore new points of view, to seek out fresh opinions, to boldly go where so many have gone before, and still somehow manage to totally miss the point. Subscribe to Sex in Space, wherever quality podcasts are found.
Hello, I am Jess.
And I am Tim.
And welcome to Sex in Space. This is our mega project that explores sex across all of its infinite dimensions.
Yes, and what we want to do is turn the awkward into the straightforward and have heaps of fun while we're at it.
Who are we listening to today, Tim?
Today we're listening to an interview which I did all on my own with the lovely Kassie Hartendorp. Now, heads up in this one, I want to hold my hand up and say that some of my pronunciation of Te Reo Maori is still in its infancy. So we're kind of on a bit of a journey with that one, similar to the sex journey, I guess, where, we've only taken a couple of steps forward. And so please bear with me on that one. Kassie is Ngāti Raukawa. She grew up in Whanganui and is based in Pōneke, which is Wellington. She's a renowned community activist and organiser, working in both areas of youth, takatāpui, anti-racism, workers' rights and housing. She's a former youth worker who supported LGBTQIA+ young people and works on the Te Wānanga Trust, a takatāpui community group. Kassie has written essays for The Spin-Off, Pantograph Punch and Vice on gender, diversity, whakamā and being queer and Māori. It's a really, really, really insightful and interesting conversation. Really, really hope you enjoy it. I know I did. So let's get into it.
And now, the interview.
Hello.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Thank you for having me here today.
Thank you for coming. This is a real privilege to have you here today. I just I've been on this kind of interesting journey recently of discovery and coming from this kind of point of view of being a kind of white cis male and delving into these worlds that I just like, completely new to me. I mean, my sex education personally was pretty minimal in the UK and all the rest of it. And so coming here and learning new things is opening my mind, blowing my mind, and generally great. And I mean, the point of this podcast is to have conversations and to bring stuff out and share it as appropriate, basically. So, takatāpui, tell me about what that word means and means to you, and is that?
That's a great question, because I think takatāpui means a lot to different people, but it also has a really specific history. And that history is that it was once used as a term to be able to define a companion of an intimate companion of the same gender.
Okay.
And it was found and reclaimed by someone called Ngā Hui Te Awe Kōtuku who reclaimed this term after finding it in old dictionaries. And there's stories that are attached to it. There are iwi-based stories attached to it, but that's not my story to tell. But what has happened over the years is that word takatāpui has been used to reclaim both existing within a world as being Māori and being sexuality or gender diverse. And, you know, some people do translate it as being like gay, lesbian, transgender, transsexual, bisexual, and so on. But it's really crucial that takatāpui is holding within it a cultural identity as well. So, which is to be Māori and is to be indigenous. But it's been reclaimed and it's now used as an expansive, embracing term for many people within the rainbow or LGBTIQ community who are also Māori. It doesn't work for everyone, but I really like it because in a world that does discriminate and have oppressive structures around sexuality, gender, and race and indigeneity, I find it very useful to be able to name yourself into being and name yourself into existence and have a word that can be heard and understood by other people and other people who might be like you. And if that means that somebody feels a sense of belonging where before they did not, then I think there is a use in having a word like that. Yeah. But there's plenty of Māori who do not use the word takatāpui. There's plenty of transgender Māori who do not use the word takatāpui. They have other words they use. But yeah, what it means to me is connecting me in to a whakapapa, to a genealogy of people who have come before me, and knowing that there would have been people within my family who would have walked differently in the world. And I also, it also is about showing my appreciation to the people who came before me within the takatāpui community. And in particular, I'm thinking about the lesbians, the gay men, the trans men, the whakawahine, the trans women who paved the way for us younger ones to be able to exist as we do now. So when I think of takatāpui, it reaches back into that whakapapa, yeah.
So when you say it was kind of, you say it was reclaimed?
Yeah.
And that's from old dictionaries, so a colonial sort of exercise in translating into English or understanding native language, is that?
I'm not sure what the original, probably the original dictionary may have been written by Pākehā and by European writers. There is some debate as to what that word originally meant. Like, for example, was an intimate companion someone that you slept with, had sex with? Was it a really close friend? There's still discussion and debate about what that word even meant back in the day.
Yeah.
But it has enough in there, I think, for people to want to reclaim it, to use it in the now to describe our identities.
Yeah. Oh, I think it's beautiful. I heard an interview with Elizabeth Kelly.
Ah, yes.
And she was talking about some translations, and I suppose in a similar way to, and this is a story of my mother who lived here in the 70s used to love telling me, the cutting off of the penises of the statues and stuff like that kind of the colonial sort of whitewashing of Māori culture, and what I sort of picked up on when listening to Elizabeth talk was that similar thing was happening to a lot of the kind of, I think it was poems.
Yep.
And some of these poems have been refound and sort of retranslated, and what they're finding is much deeper meaning to some of the words, and exploring some of the themes of perhaps like gender, sexuality, and stuff like that. And it was, it blew my mind as to how kind of colonial our look has been.
Can I speak to that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, because I've thought about this a lot, and in particular, I've had Māori scholars say things like, we don't have many records of sexuality or gender diversity within Aotearoa pre-colonial. And I just think that we've even lost the way how to look for those. We've lost the lens for how to see how people would have lived, and in more ways than just our sexualities and our genders, To me, it doesn't make any sense that there would be so many different indigenous cultural genders and sexualities that were quite normal around the world, and especially within the Pacific. The Pacific, as you probably know, is like a vast myriad of so many different gender identities in particular, and they have names, and there are words that have been passed down over generations. They have roles that have been passed down over generations, and so we came from the Pacific as Māori, so then it makes me question, are we the only Pacific society who did not have that kind of gender diversity?
Yeah.
Did we leave it in the Pacific? That doesn't make any sense to me. And the more that I talk to people and the more that I learn to read between the lines and to know where to look, the answers are there. Yeah. So recently, I was looking into gender diversity within pre-colonial Aotearoa and colonial Aotearoa as well, and finding these little remnants in strange places, like, for example, Ngahuia Te Awa Kotuku talking about the tourism industry here and how there's a story that she tells at Whakarewarewa in Rotorua, and Europeans would come and be guided by Māori. It was a really booming economic tourism industry in that time. And there's a passage that she talks about where she says that, this tourist who came here is saying, I was invited to go and sit in the family circle among, the Māori, and there was this lovely Māori belle there, this beautiful woman, and and she ended up offering me some tobacco, and it was all very well. And then, to my surprise and shock, it turned out that she was actually a man. And there's so much that is just in that story, and there are more stories of that around the Pacific, of European sailors or people who are recording things, telling stories of meeting people they thought were women, but then it turns out that their gender was a bit more fluid, and then being shocked or disgusted about it. And the interesting thing is that what I got from that passage was you had a woman, you had someone who was living as a woman, expressing themselves as a woman, and that they were accepted within their family circle. They were there.
Yeah.
They weren't booted out into the bush somewhere. They were in the family circle.
They would have had some value and, completely for numerous different things. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I sort of see there seem to be gendered roles in kind of that in the Māori culture and the sort of family, and also in some of the what's the word for it? But in some of the sort of the origin stories and stuff like that. But if, like you said, you read between the lines, you can sort of see that these are the bits that have been picked out as being acceptable. In terms of your own sort of journey and education, more specifically, I mean, one of the reasons for this podcast is we feel there's this massive gap in people talking, and one of the things is, the education formally or otherwise, or through family and etc. Can be lacking in certain places. I was just quite interested in sort of how you got to where you are now, but like what your education was like. Did you have a any sort of formal education, or even at school? Like, what do you remember that experience? What your sex education was? Did you get introduced to the concepts of gender or anything like that in any formal way, or was it as bad as mine?
Well, I do remember sex education classes, because they were quite funny, because we went to a all-girls same-sex school.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of dynamic, I think, that would happen in our classes where we could all take the piss a little bit and have a laugh about it. And it was in Wanganui Girls College is where I went. And there was I remember being the person nominated to put a condom on a banana in front of the class, and everyone thought it was hilarious. Like, it was just this big joke. I don't know whether or not it was because I was doing it or what. But it was, when I think about it, right then and there, you're being taught that the only kind of sex that you're going to have is as a girl or a woman is with someone with a penis.
Yeah.
And that's the only option. Being at a same-sex school, it was not, the way that I felt at least was that if you're at a girls' school, you're either sluts or lesbians, maybe both.
Yeah.
And so I think that people did a lot to try to not be associated with those, and probably more about not being associated with being a lesbian. I think there were lots of proud, promiscuous girls at our school, and as they should be, but there were no out and proud lesbians or queer girls or so on, and it definitely wasn't a part of the education system at all. It wasn't even a possibility, and it felt usually like, and it might be the same for most people, that sex education was about how not to get pregnant for the next few years, and just hold off that.
Yeah.
And there was nothing about pleasure. There was nothing about what our own bodies even are. And there was nothing about all of the joys and possibilities of what sexuality can hold.
In terms of, for you, like, I suppose transitionally, or like, have you had any like major shifts in your understanding, or like in sort of learning more about, like, when did you start learning about the Māori culture and that sort of stuff? Is that something that you've always been interested in, or has that?
No, so I was adopted as a baby into a completely Pākehā family, or Dutch and British, and in that time it wasn't really talked about me being Māori, and I can make guesses as to why that is. I don't know all the reasons. And I didn't have any contact with my Māori whānau, with my family as well on that side. And what I realised, I was told when I was about maybe 13 or 14 that I was Māori. And it meant something to me, but not enough. I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't know what to do with that information. I was given a scrap of paper that had from my birth parents that had my iwi affiliation on it, and I just thought to myself, okay, if it's important to them that I knew this, then that must be important. But I didn't know what to do with it. I had no idea what to do with that, and so it's really been quite. I think it's been a journey of holding a lot of different things, because I've often felt like I don't want to disrespect my adoptive parents and their culture and their upbringing, and they've been amazing parents, but also being like there are more elements to me than what is my adoptive family, juggling that has been a definite tension.
It's very interesting that that you're right, that note, or the little bit of information that you got was clearly there for a reason. That's quite an amazing little sort of seed, isn't it?
And there's been a few of those. There's these little seeds, and but most of the time, I actually remember thinking when I was a teenager, I'm gonna put that away for later. That's what I thought. I'll put that away for later. And, not many people can do that because I look white, I look Pākehā, I can move through life and people don't think that I'm Māori. And so there is not a pressure on me to know my whakapapa and to know my culture and to know my genealogy than people who, are what is seen as visibly, stereotypically Māori. Yeah. So I had a privilege to be able to put that piece of paper away and put that away. But I also knew that in terms of my adoption, I was not psychologically ready for following that path, and that I would know when the time would be. And that time was in my mid-20s, and I started to reconnect with my adoptive family, and with my hapu, my wider extended family, and my marae, our family ancestral meeting house, and things like this. But it all it has been a massive shift because it's about who you are and where you come from. And what sat with me was that I felt like there was a reason that I hadn't really been told that I was Māori or nurtured as Māori. Like, for me, there was something about that was very political. I was like, this isn't a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that I just happened to not know anything about that side. And then as I grew older, I realized that I was one of the last babies to be adopted in a certain kind of way. And that before me especially, there are whole generations of Māori babies and children who were taken off their families and their parents and put into Pākehā families. And what I realised was that within the project of colonisation, the colonisers would have been very happy and content and pleased with me never knowing or acknowledging my Māoriness, because that would have been a slow cultural genocide, yeah? And so within Aotearoa, you might know, a lot of other countries were colonised before us, and the way that I've been taught is that the British people had more of a nous and an understanding about how to go about these things. And so we often, literally to this day, people in law schools and Pākehā law schools here get taught that we had a more humanitarian colonisation.
Right.
And that's part of, we had a treaty. Lots of places didn't have treaties. We're very lucky Indigenous people. And so a lot of that has meant and required, I've also been taught by other people, by Māori, that actually colonisation is very expensive, and the British government couldn't justify sending in an expensive military to come in and colonise us in the way that other countries were colonised, because they didn't have enough money to be able to sustain a militia, right? Yeah. So they had to utilise other different ways, and a lot of that relied on missionaries, and a lot of that relied on actually just completely, first of all, taking our land off us, and colonising our minds and destroying our connection to who we are and our genealogies. And there's a street in Wellington called Featherston Street, and the person who that is named after had a quote where he basically says, our job is to smooth the pillow of the dying Māori race, and so the world will look well upon us. And what I realised in that time is that the colonisers wanted Māori to all die out, and they would either do that on purpose and cause it, or they would do it in a way where, for example, you just don't take any action. You see Native people dying and you take no action, and you allow them to just die off so that they can inherit this country and this land, which is ultimately what they wanted. And when I talk about Pākehā, I talk about a very specific group of people. It's not everyone. There were lots of Pākehā who came here who formed beautiful relationships with Māori, and many who were socialists as well, and actually saw communism and socialism in a lot of the ways that we worked here and were interested in that. So I'm not talking about every single Pākehā here, not all Pākehā, but what I will say is the people in charge there is an ulterior motive for us to die out so they could inherit our land. And so then for me, when I think about my adoption, I'm like, far it is actually a very symbolic and political thing to live in my Māoriness and honour my ancestors so that they did not die in vain. That's as simple as it is to me. And so I don't spend a lot of Māori spend a lot of time wondering, are we enough? Are we Māori enough? Are we this enough? Are we that enough? And I try not to go there because I believe that the tool of colonisation is for us to constantly be paralysed by the idea that we are not enough. And so we just disappear. We just slowly disappear. And I can't do that.
No.
And now, this.
Tashidelic intergalactic lovelings, I'm Ambigua, therapist at Barbarella's, the finest gratification destination in the entire Virgo constellation. All sentient beings are welcome at Barbarella's, and all desires fulfilled, all currencies accepted. However, there's only one area we won't compromise: lubrication. We find nothing smooths the path of true loving like Never Dry. Distilled from the juice of the sapient analipsis shrub, from their own plantations on Epsilon Sea, Never Dry allows your fantasies to flourish in a frictionless environment. You can concentrate on your own selfish, narcissistic outcome in complete confidence with Never Dry. We use nothing else. And for this space-time unit only, mention this ad at Barbarella's and get a low polish, absolutely free. Love long and proper with Never Dry. Barbarella's, your pleasure is our business.
And now we return to your unscheduled program.
What I will say is, the colonisation of everything, and especially ourselves and our minds, means that we have lost our original tikanga, or our ways of being and our ways of doing things. And so we have what is often called imposter tikanga. And so we've now got replacements of our tikanga that we as Māori accept as truth. And even those are based on colonial lies, unfortunately. And that's the hardest part. That's the hardest part, because we are in a period of really incredible cultural revitalisation that is only possible by the Māori who fought fearlessly before us, right? And I am a beneficiary. I'm a beneficiary of that struggle, and that I can now learn about tikanga, about Māori laws and ways of being. And to me, when you go back to those actual laws and ways of being, a lot of stuff just strips away. It falls away. It no longer, if the most important thing, as Māori was whakapapa. It was always whakapapa. Our lives are about whakapapa, and that is about social relationships. It is about interconnection to the earth, to the deities, to each other, to everything. It is just a constant lens and map of social relationships, right? And it is about maintaining our whakapapa at all times. It is about continuing people being able to live and flourish and exist. And if that was the primary lens by which our ancestors lived, it does not make any sense why we would leave behind someone who does not sleep with someone of the right sex or gender. Because the most important thing was whakapapa. The most important thing was belonging and the collective and the strength of the collective, and everyone had something to contribute. And so why would you disown a young queer kid or a young trans kid, which I see constantly. I see this constantly as our own whānau Māori rejecting our own children. And I just don't believe that's what our ancestors would have done, because every child was and is precious to whakapapa. So why would you cast them away? It makes no sense.
No, it doesn't. You really wonder where that's come from. I think you're right. I think it's a mistelling your own origins, isn't it? It's,
Yeah.
yeah.
And it's dangerous when we start to believe them and wield them against each other, which goes on a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I sort of, do you know, does that get spun, or do those stories get sort of justified from a religious point of view or a cultural point of view, or how do they get justified in
lots of different ways? But
Right.
I mean, I think a case in point is Destiny Church, which is probably the biggest church that has mass numbers of Māori in it. And they stood against the Civil Union Bill and when that was being passed, and have consistently made statements. Their leaders have made statements, and they are Māori. They have made statements against homosexuality very clearly, and it is a religious thing. But in all honesty, I don't know, and I can't speak for where all of that comes from. All I know is that what I try to do is just constantly keep leaning into the goodness that exists within our takatāpui communities, to just keep moving towards that. And so I don't spend as much time moving towards where the hate comes from, and it's probably a good thing to know and to analyse so we can create change. But what I know is that movement towards people has gives life and brings life, and that's what we need.
yeah as opposed to constantly sort of struggling, or do you mean being around negative people? Or
I mean, I couldn't tell you exactly why homophobic people make public homophobic statements. I don't know where that all comes from. They will have their own reasons for that. But I do think that over time that has been reflected in our laws, that has been reflected in our society, and of course people are going to believe that. And I also do think that, people are hurting and Māori communities are hurting, and what they're often doing is trying to find some way of explaining it and pointing to something of why that could happen. And there are some people who think, the breakdown of the family, and actually it's when people started being gay and we never had this. This is a modern recent Pākehā thing, and this isn't us. And trying to grasp for ways of why our communities are in so much poverty and why we're struggling. And sometimes it ends up pointing fingers at each other and fighting against each other, and that's what colonialism does, right?
Yeah.
And then whatever remaining natives are left, we just destroy each other, and then we've done the job for them.
Yeah. It's the modern cultural equivalent of giving tribes weapons to kill each other.
Mm-hmm. I'm not trying to be real bleak about this.
No,
I actually feel
I
quite hopeful, but people feel like they are hated and like they are disgusting, and that is a really difficult thing to move through. And even for me, as someone who is quite publicly out as takatāpui, I often have had to have moments where I grapple with the ways that hate has built homes within my own body and within my own self, and realizing that, oh my gosh, like the whole reason I do this or am like this is because of some distant survival or coping mechanism, which was ultimately about believing that I was hated and disgusting and unnatural and wrong. And how nice it would be to begin life without having that inside you, and how it's a corrosive effect on your spirit and your mind and your body. Like it destroys you, and our communities are rife with substance abuse and alcohol abuse and obviously suicidality and self-harm and all these things. But there's also all these little things that that you wouldn't even necessarily put a name to. Like, I have quite serious work addiction issues, and it's pretty much just from me trying to work away my, not just self-hate, but work. The idea in my head is that if I just work really, really hard, I'm not going to be that yuck, unnatural, disgusting thing, And that's a really confronting thing, to be able to have a conversation with yourself about that and think about all these habits that you've had over the years where you're like, it literally just stems from this hate and disgust and this shame, because I can talk about it. I can talk about it to you right now because I've made movements through that shame, but the majority of people have not. They have not, and they are suffering alone and in shame and not talking to anyone and just sitting with that stigma and that hate inside themselves. And we've made great efforts. I love that you can get married here if you're same sex and so on. But for example, right now we're having a really big backlash against transgender communities going on. And we have people who describe themselves as feminists being anti-transgender because they believe that it impinges on their rights as women. And it's basically just transphobia and anti-trans rhetoric dressed up in a different kind of outfit, really. And these have real impacts. They sit within us because we can't, especially in a heavy media saturated world now. It's not just like our local community that we're worried about how they treat us. It's this huge global community, and it's everywhere, and it's all pervasive, and it's constant. And I think that almost exacerbates and intensifies the possibility of that hate as well inside ourselves. And that's a lot for any one person to sit with.
Yeah. I mean, I remember sort of mild anxiety as a teenager, living in a small town in the UK, and it was, completely different. But you're this was in the sort of 80s and 90s, and you sort of, it was a small town, and the anxiety stops at where the town stops. You know what I mean? You're just sort of worried about the people that might see you walking down the street, or that kind of thing. But to move that up and move that online, say, suddenly you're right, it's 7 billion people or judging you or can comment. Very troubling indeed.
Again, I feel like I'm being very bleak.
No.
But I don't feel like I can talk about takatāpui without also talking about the material realities that we have to live.
Yeah.
And I love leaning into the beauty and the joy and everything incredible that is to Māoritanga. But to me, my reclaiming of Māoritanga is because I see that there are problems in the world, and this is a way forward through those problems. This is solutions. But it doesn't mean that we can just ignore the reality of what people are dealing with right now.
Yeah. Is there anything you wish you'd learned, or if you could go back and talk to younger Kassie, little Kassie, what anything you'd pass back?
I mean, I think I would just say things are going to be hard, but you will get through it.
Yeah.
And you are going to meet some unlikely guides and allies and friends, and you will find love in many, many places, and that will carry you forward. And also to think about what pleasure means, I think, is really important, because I think that pleasure is the opposite of hate and pain and suffering. And we don't have a society that is very pleasure-focused, I don't think. And even I'm not very pleasure-focused. This is something I'm learning on as well, and just how amazing it would be to be talking about the possibilities of relationships and love and connection and pleasure, because there is so much. There is so much to be had, but sex education feels like a teenage pregnancy risk mitigation exercise. And there is no moment that is even about our pleasure. And I think that, that was very important, pre-colonial. I think that pleasure was really crucial, know. And so, I think it's thinking about that as how to make way for pleasure in a world that is so bleak so often, and you're going to feel like you can't do anything about it, but there is still love and pleasure, and you need to move towards that.
It's the shifting of the focus, eh? Yeah. Amazing. Well, let's try and... That's a good positive... That's a good positive. We're moving away from the bleakness. Misunderstandings about takatāpui. Are there any common misunderstandings? Just back to that word and what it...
I think misunderstandings are that every Māori identifies as takatāpui.
Okay,
and also, as I've mentioned, but also I think in that is there's, I think, misunderstandings by Pākehā about where Māori are at in terms of their own Māoritanga and their Māoriness. And we're kind of reaching a point where it's okay to be Māori, and in some places it's cool to be Māori. And there's an expectation that you're at this level and you're cool like this, or you're here with that. But actually that's not... We're grappling with years of colonisation, and we're not often at a particular level or place. We are where we are, And so takatāpui is a word that has mostly been utilised by people who have access to takatāpui communities. So I learnt that word from hanging with older takatāpui and at Big Hui, and appreciating and honouring them and loving them, and so wanting to be using those terms as well. But I was really privileged in being able to even go to a hui that was a gathering that was full of takatāpui. So to me, it's not the same for everyone, and we shouldn't just assume that it is. And to have humility, I think it's really important for Pākehā to have humility towards Māori in terms of their path and their journey around what all of this means. So that's one. And then another big misunderstanding is that takatāpui is actually just a Pākehā thing, or as a European thing, and being gay or transgender is just as a Pākehā thing. And so even within our own communities, policing each other on what is right or wrong, which is obviously the hardest part, because I don't really care if, someone from the old male pale stale brigade, points a finger at me and has an issue with me. But if someone who is Māori makes an attack on me based on my sexuality, my identity, then that cuts straight to the core. That really hurts. Yeah. And so, I guess the misunderstanding is still the learning and healing that we need to do within our own communities to realise actually this is a part of our history, whether we like it or not, and that's okay.
Yeah. Let's tell as many people as possible.
Yeah, queer sex wasn't just invented by Europeans. Hell no, that would never happen. It's too good.
Yeah. Oh, we've been trying to tuck that away behind the couch for years. Yeah. Thank you so much for doing this.
No, thank you for inviting me in.
Well, folks, I hope you loved hearing all about Indigenous gender and sexuality from the gorgeous Kassie Hartendorp. If you want to watch their documentary called He Kākano Aho, which is about the takatāpui experience, you can go to www.ngataonga.org.nz. I'll spell that for you, ngataonga.org.nz. It's an incredible little short documentary made by Loading Docs. And this year, actually, 2021, Kassie was selected to give the Peter Wells Lecture in Pride 2021. So, I think that might also be available online. But, just so you know, we were talking to a pretty fancy person.
Pretty fancy.
Yeah, totally. So, look, as you know, we're just starting out This is our first series of podcasts, and we do have some amazing interviews. We really encourage you to check out the other ones, ending HIV, raising children and non-binary, the future of sex education, Asians and sex, the history of sex work in New Zealand. We've got some incredible guests, so we really recommend you jump into those, and we would love to hear from you, the audience. We want to hear what you loved, what you hated. Give us your feedback and your ideas and the topics you want covered and the people we need to be talking to. Just check in with us with pictures or emails or voice recordings to hello@sexandspace.com. We would love to include them in upcoming episodes. And also you can follow us. There's nothing wrong with a good follow on
There is
Facebook.
nothing wrong with it.
Facebook and Instagram, which is at sexandspace.com. That's sexandspace, DOTCOM.
Yes, DOTCOM. I'll get used to saying that. If you enjoyed this podcast, or even any of the others, and had any spare digital swipes, clicks, or any of that kind of stuff to go around, then leaving us a 5-star review or a rating on Apple Podcasts would be amazing. So we'll be trying to shout them out. We'll definitely be shouting out those on some future episodes. So please keep them nice and sexy. A massive thanks to all our guests, the amazing folks at the Armory Recording Studios in Wellington, to the team at String Theory, to Andrew, Tanya, Brandon, David, and Richard for their amazing voices. And of course, many thanks to my amazing co-host, Jess Holly Bates.
So welcome.
And thank you to you for making it all the way to the end of another podcast. Join us next week. Bye.
Bye.
If you found some of this material a little challenging, keep coming back and we'll make it really challenging.